Hello and welcome to the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies today for the third Lavender Lunch of our academic year. We are really thrilled to welcome Kendra Twenter today, and she will be speaking on the Bible, but make it kinky, a queer reading of traumatic Bible stories. And so in this lunch, Kendra, who uses pronouns she and hers, centers women of the Bible who were abused, unnamed, and used to justify the inappropriate crossing of boundaries. Based upon a video series that she created for her final project for a Certificate of Sexuality and Religion here from Pacific School of Religion, Kendra today is going to discuss some essential aspects of kink and sex as they appear in the biblical accounts of Bathsheba, the whore of Babylon, and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Kendra will also explore aspects of the ongoing abuse and mistreatment of women today. Kendra holds a master's degree in Sexuality Studies, a certificate in Sexuality and Religion, the CSR from Pacific School of Religion, as well as a Bachelor of Science Degree in Athletic Training. And recently, as if that weren't enough, she's also begun a master's degree program in Marriage and Family Therapy at the University of San Francisco. And her work experience includes leading trainings in the areas of human sexuality, religion, and systemic oppressions for the United Methodist Church, for embassies, and for other communities. Just some housekeeping details. We are recording today's Lavender Lunch. It is being live streamed now on Facebook. We will also post it on our social media outlets. We will not, however, post any of the messages in the chat. And then as I continue advertising, I would encourage you to consider joining us this Thursday when we will have a CLGS Queer and Latinx Faith conversation with Carolina Ramos speaking on the role of Latinx faith communities in HIV/AIDS prevention and care. That's this Thursday. And then also Thursday evening, we have our 12th annual CLGS Georgia Harkness Lecture with newly ordained, at least as a bishop, Megan Rohr, a PSR alum, who will be speaking on trans theology without apology. You can check all that out on the website. I'll put that in the chat. So without any further ado, I welcome Kendra.
Thank you. It's nice to see all of you. I'm going to try to share my screen. I was having a problem a minute ago, but maybe it'll work now. Actually, is it possible for you to share your screen and I can just say next screen? Is that okay?
Sure. Let me see how it.
It's actually a little easier for me.
Okay. There we go. Kendra, how do I start it? Is there something I push for it to?
You can just leave it like this. If it doesn't say present, it's fine. I can just do it from here.
Okay, cool.
No worries. I also will apologize. First off, I work in a middle school. And so if there is a loud bell, I'm going to turn off my volume. They know not to knock on the door at the moment, but we can only be so sure. So the Bible, but make it kinky. I named my project this because for one, it draws people in. But while doing my project, I realized how much biblical stories have to do with kink. If you could go to the next one. Cool. So about me and why this project. I grew up in Missouri, so the Bible Belt, where we would really we had the sex talks, but it was always abstinence. There was no context. There were pictures of genitals with different STIs, and it was really scary and traumatic to be a part of that. After that, I went to undergrad still in Missouri, and then I went to Russia after. I had never really left Missouri. And so never leaving Missouri and then going to Russia, I had no clue what I was getting into. But I was working with people who were being trafficked, whether it be for slave labor or sex exploitation. it was a really intense job, but I was able to learn how to talk about sex and sex education to go over a whole bunch of different cultures. So I would teach sex education to the Russians that would visit. So most of our clients were from West Africa. I went there through the United Methodist Church, but it definitely gave me an overall way to talk about sex. While living in Russia, it was a different kind of mindset, and it is the reason that I continued to get degrees. But Russia has a different way of talking about reproductive justice. So getting an abortion could be normal and was normalized, but talking about STIs and STI prevention was not. People would give you a different look for asking about getting STI tested versus getting an abortion. So it made me really intrigued on how the world in itself talks about sex and sex education. When I moved back from Russia, I was like, what can I do with all of this information? Sex is still scary to a lot of people. How do I have this conversation? So I decided to get my master's in sexuality studies at San Francisco State University. A master's in sexuality studies is only at SFSU. Lots of places have gender and sex, lots of people or lots of universities have like women's studies, but specifically a master's in sexuality studies was only at SFSU. While there, I did my thesis on the United Methodist Church and the queer ordination and the huge convention that they had in St. Louis, which was interesting that they chose to have it in Missouri. And so that's what I wrote my master's on, and I wanted to have deeper conversations. So I went to PSR, where I started this project to get my certification in sexuality and religion. Currently, I'm getting my master's in marriage and family therapy because I would like to be a sex therapist and not just, I want to have an overall range where I talk about religious trauma and how that impacts people's desires, their relationships, and the ways that they view the world. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for this project, I really just wanted to find biblical stories that centered women. So the ones that were accused and abused, harmed, and nameless. The reason that I chose this is because I realized that religious stories always put me to sleep. And I never knew why. Why am I falling asleep? Especially growing up in the Bible Belt, like why am I falling asleep in church? And I realized because that was my trauma response. Each of these stories is very traumatic, and the only way that I mentally could get through it was by opting out and going to bed. And so I really wanted to focus on that. So I started this project with some guided practice and conversation with Professor Sharon Jacob. If you ever get to talk to them, wonderful human. And would really just question like, how do the people relate into these stories? Who are the women that we want to center? Who isn't seen, who isn't invited to the table, or who is invited to the table but told to be quiet? Alongside with what is the reader doing? What are we doing when we read these? What kind of feelings are we taking on? And why do we actually keep reading the same stories over and over again? Why I chose kink as my lens and not sex. So I, full disclosure, am a part of like kink communities. So I had a little bit more intel and conversation into what those look like. But I also am a sex educator. So continuing to have these conversations is just a part of who I am. And I realized that there were some connections. So kink is viewed as very taboo. Kink often is thought of as just like these public displays, but here we have these biblical stories that I've chosen that are actually just like very public and very in your face and what that kind of looks like. And so along with kink and BDSM and consent and these stories, I realized that we're talking about a topic and trying to also decenter it. So we are making sure that it is spoken about, but also going around the topic to have a different conversation. Next slide, please. So during this entire project, the entire goal was to be accessible. So growing up, I read stories, but I never read them myself. I also didn't have the resources to do so, and realized that most people don't have the resources to do so. In making this video, I just posted the first video on YouTube to be watched, and it will give you all of the definitions that I use in the videos. I don't want to make the assumption that anyone knows what these words are, or how I'm using them. Different people can have different definitions, and I wanted to make sure that I am accessible as possible, and also like include my email if people have questions or want to call me in or call me out on what was being said. So I'm going to give you all some of the definitions before I actually dive into what the videos were. So the first one is kinky, which is any non-conventional sex practices. That's a very broad term. But what people call kinky is just anything that's not conventional and not like normalized. A voyeur or voyeurism is when someone enjoys watching people. So typically this is thought of in a sexual lens, but I kind of use it all over, right? And the opposite of that is someone who likes to be watched, which is an expeditionist. I can never say that word. Next is consent. So how I remember consent is by saying fries, which means it's freely given, it's reversible, it's informed, it's enthusiastic, and it's specific. That actually comes from Planned Parenthood and how they teach it. Consent includes includes conversations about like being enthusiastic and informed and completely communicated with wanting to participate in as an active participant. People usually only use consent when talking about sex, but consent should also come with conversations. So I appreciate you all joining and consenting to listen to me talk. Next is trauma. Trauma is anything that is deeply distressing or discerning. So I talked about how it was traumatic to read these stories. And I do want to let you know that parts of this can be traumatic. So feel free to opt out if you need to and take that space for yourself. These two terms, these next two are a little bit deeper. So a snuff film is when a person is filmed while actually being harmed. So it's usually when someone dies by suicide or is murdered. Those videos get filmed and they're a little bit more common than we may think. And Black brutality interest is a word that I actually came up with. The reason that I wanted a word that related to snuff films but was a little bit deeper is because it's the desire to see people being killed. It's this desire to see mostly BIPOC folks be murdered. And there was no real word that encompassed this, but people have this desire and I wanted to know what it was. So a way to think about it is that it's not new. Enslavers used to make people fight to the death. There were public hangings. We currently still have public executions, or we have Black folks that are killed by police, and people have this like innate desire to watch those videos over and over again, with different reasons that they say they do so, but it is still a desire to see Black folks be killed. Next slide, please. So the first video that I talk about is about voyeurism. So that's wanting to watch people. And I discussed Bathsheba, Susanna, and the Whore of Babylon. The reason I chose those three is because Bathsheba, in the videos, I tell the complete story because I wanted it to be accessible. So I make sure that like you don't have to open, if you want to open your Bible and read the stories too, so you have your understanding, but I wanted to make sure people had all the resources they needed. So Bathsheba is a story where she was watched by David. Susanna was coerced by the elders in her community. And then the Whore of Babylon is being watched by an angel and also someone else. Today we would kind of think of them as like peeping toms or stalking. Each of these women were watched in a different way and were just stalked by the people who wanted their attention and couldn't get it. So the book that is the picture is Why Does He Do That? Is more of like a psychology book, but it discusses why certain men are angry and controlling. So the reasons that they give that they do the things that they do. And it helped me to look into these stories about the way that I am biased towards abuse that has happened and continues to happen by people by letting people use these like scapegoat terms to get away with abuse. So also a really good book if you're wanting to continue into what I've already done and analyze how these people have gotten away with abuse in the way that we talk about it also. So when I used this book for these 3 stories, I thought about like who is actually abusing their power. David and the elders are using their authority, right? They're telling these women that I must have you and you have to give in to me. The angel in the Whore of Babylon, someone is looking at her and I was like, gosh, so gorgeous. And the angel then manipulates that mindset into why this person should not look at her that way. So the angels manipulate the narrative while David and the elders are actually manipulating their communities and the women at their hands. I discussed what my trauma response is to reading these stories, which is sleep. That has never went away. I want to be very honest. Even doing this, it was really hard putting together the presentation to not fall back into that. But in these stories, the women also have trauma responses. We usually think of them as fight or flight, but there's more to that. There's also freeze, where you stop doing what you're doing. Fight is where you fight back. Flight is where you would run away. And then fawn is where you actually do as the abuser is telling you. So with these stories, Bathsheba and the Whore of Babylon both are fawn. They're doing what the abuser says for their safety, or because they actually don't know the manipulation that has went into their stories. Susanna fought back against the elders when they tried to coerce her into having sex. But no trauma response is bad. However you respond to a situation is how you respond to a situation, and that is okay. So next I want to think about us as voyeurs. People, when they hear this term, they're like, that can't be me. But how many people like to people watch? How many people watch porn? There are lots of moments where you're just like observing for a class. That makes you a voyeur. And sometimes we think of like an expeditionist as like someone who's putting on that show for you. One of the best ways to think about voyeurs in our time now is porn. So I went on to Pornhub. They every year have where they tell you all of their statistics. They didn't for 2020, and it's probably because they're probably like still sifting through that. 2020 was wild. Everyone was home. They had a lot of information. But for 2019, that was 40 billion visits in a year. That's 115 million visits a day. So the top searches were point of view, femdom, Korean, Asian, Latina, Indian, BBC, and ebony. So you can kind of see by those top searches that people wanted their own point of view. They wanted to be the voyeur, but a lot of the terms that were used, 7 out of 8 searches are actually race-based. So that can give a little bit more insight into what that is. BBC is big black cock. So another term that would be used to look into racial identities. When in 2019, Pornhub took down 80% of their videos. That was because people were saying that their actual physical assaults and their sexual harassments were on the streaming site. So Pornhub responded by taking 80% down. That still left millions of videos up. One of the top people who I've heard talk about wanting their story down is Mia Khalifa. But still in 2019, although coming out that she wanted her story and her porn taken down, she was still the #2 search. So while some stories got taken down, they did not take down everyone's. Next slide, please. So the next video in the series is about sexual violence and trauma. I just want to check in to make sure you all are doing okay. This next part is about sexual assault. So if you need to take a break, give yourself space for that. Definitely understand. For these stories, I talked about Gomar, Sodom and Gomorrah, and then the concubine that is in Judges 19 and 21. A little about the stories. Gomar was told to marry and have kids, had no choice in that. Sodom and Gomorrah is typically the story that's used against homosexuality, but I focus on the daughters that were put up for sacrifice. And then the concubine in Judges 19 through 21 is also put up to be assaulted. And so is the daughters of the person they're staying with. And then when she is done being assaulted, her husband cuts her up and sends her pieces around. So thinking about kink and abuse, often people assume that kink and kinky relationships are abusive. But kink is based off of consent. Consent is the foundation of all relationships. It should be the foundation of all things, and all sexual interactions, along with all interactions in general. So abuse is not taken lightly in kink communities and in group settings. Typically, if someone knows, and I can't speak for everyone, but in group settings where I've been, if someone violates someone or makes them feel uncomfortable, they're told to leave. If you don't consent to an activity, the person who is being abusive is told to leave. So I like to point that out, that often people misconstrue that, but those are very different. Control is also given to people in kinky relationships and in different settings in BDSM. It's consensual, it's discussed beforehand, it's discussed during, it's discussed after. In all of these stories, when thinking about assault and trauma, there was no consent. There was also just abuse happening with the guise of someone has to be in control and someone gets to be in control. So for Gomar, she had no decision in being married or having kids. Her husband was just told to go get her. She would be the one because she was a harlot. So because she was deemed a certain way, she was told that she must have children. In Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot gives up his daughters. When they're trying to take the angels, Lot is like, nope, have them. Here they are instead. And then the daughters later take advantage of him by getting him drunk. This is similar to the ways that in Bathsheba's story, David got her husband drunk and then killed him because of it. And in the last story with abuse and assault, when it talks about the concubine, it never discusses if she is dead. She was assaulted, she was violently assaulted all night long. She ends up on the doorstep and her husband picks her up, takes her home, and then he cuts her up. So did he kill her? He put her up to be harmed, and then he continued to do harm to her and her body. So I question often, who is the abuser? Is it God? Is it the husbands? Is it the angels? Do we continue abuse when we read these stories and dissect them? Asking if God is an abuser can sometimes be a conflict that people have. But if we're thinking about God being the one who is telling someone you have to marry her or sending the angels in, then who becomes the abuser? Who becomes the oppressor in this moment? Is God just watching? Is the author just watching? But also, are we fulfilling some of our own sadistic desires? When we read these stories about abuse and assault, what does that do to us? Sexual assault today is often talked about, but not much work goes into it a lot of the time, unfortunately. Thinking about college campuses and the documentary about them being a hunting ground. In the United States, a woman is assaulted every 93 seconds. About 1 in 6 men has been assaulted. And these numbers probably do not reflect actual numbers, as coming forward can be hard. These numbers are also higher amongst LGBTQ plus individuals and BIPOC folks. BIPOC means Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So keeping that in mind, that there's still stigma when coming forward and telling your stories, so these numbers might be higher. I'm so sorry. I thought about when doing these videos, what do these stories teach? I've heard them multiple times, but the angels don't step in to help when the daughters are offered. Well, also, like, the concubine is hurt by her husband and no one questions the harm that's done to her, but the harm that was done to him because he was made a mockery of. So I kind of dove into that just a little bit more about how these stories allow abuse and abusers to get away with what is happening because they can use these stories. Next slide, please. can go ahead and start. Is it letting you go to the next one? It should be right under. I can't hear you, Bernie. No worries. I can just talk about it. I have no problem with that. So the last one in the video is about Black Lives Matter and the nameless women. So I use the stories of Hagar, just nameless women in general, and then the woman clothed by the sun. So Hagar is also told to have children or told to have a child and then despised for it. She gets kicked out into the wilderness. The woman clothed by the sun had a child with lots of pain. It was very painful for her, and a dragon was waiting to eat her child. God took her child immediately after she had him, and she had to flee. That sounds like the right word. Into the wilderness to protect herself so that she wouldn't be killed. And then the nameless women. Women are usually still to this day defined by their relationship to others or their reputation or any other identifier beside their name. So some of the examples in the Bible are, they just say wife, they say daughter, they say virgin of honor, the wife sold for debt, the woman who is taken in adultery, widow or maid. The reason is that naming these women makes them powerful. Once you name someone, it gives you a reason to take them down and a reason that they must be defeated. So I also discussed sadomasochism. I could never say that word also. Really fun being a part of a kink community and not able to say words. So that's a sadist is someone who likes to inflict pain, while a masochist enjoys the pain. I question who is who in these stories. Like I said earlier, are we fulfilling our own sadistic desires when we read them? And what does that look like to us? Is God also fulfilling sadistic desires by having these stories told? It really makes you question who is liking the pain and who is inflicting it. Snuff films. So I discussed earlier how those are actual films of people dying by suicide or being murdered. But what also with the Black brutality interest is wanting to see these people. Think about this in the ways of people who reenact Jesus's death for holidays, or keeping a cross in your house that has Jesus hanging from it. And you pass that each day, but you're also acknowledging that there's pain in that, and seeing it and hanging it up in multiple places. This continues today in the way that in 2020, there was people beginning to realize that Black people are being harmed. And the videos of George Floyd's death were streamed over and over again. Although communities asked, please don't do that. Can you not show the video? Can we not do that? People had to watch it. And for whatever reason, they needed to have their own thoughts about who was wrong and who was right, and completely disregarded that a community of people asked for someone's death not to be shown. It wasn't just shown on social media networks, it was shown on the news, over and over again, day and night. And people had the desire to see it. That's why it was streamed. And so this continues today in the way that we're watching people be harmed. When thinking about the women for these stories, I talk about Black Lives Matter and how it goes with snuff films and Black brutality interest. But even deeper than that is the fact that Black Lives Matter had another section of it, right, where it'd say her name. And that goes to show that we continue to leave women, and especially Black and BIPOC women, behind. Black women are the 3 Black women started Black Lives Matter and still had to have a portion where we're like, say her name. On the screen, you see 4 names. Those are names of women that sometimes get forgotten, or maybe you've never heard. Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland are often discussed, but what about Tiana and Dominique. Those are trans women, and often trans Black women are the ones who are most likely to be killed in violence, but their names aren't said. They're usually the nameless. Even when we say her name, if we're not being specific, we are being the same kind of oppressor who is leaving out the names of these women who are harmed. So all in all, there are 4 videos. And these stories are just to show that biblical stories depict sex and violence, harm, and kink in ways that I would find disgraceful. When thinking about this with kink, I wanted to make sure that people know that these are not kink relationships. These are not even sexual relationships that should be read and smiled upon. These are stories of abuse and harm that people have used to try to prove a point about relationships in general, but they go overall to continue harming women today, and should make us really rethink how we view biblical stories that have to depict sex and women. So yeah, and then that is all I have for the presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
Wondering if I could start, Kendra. Can you hear me? So I've always been a big fan of your work, and I think it's so cool that you worked with Professor Jacob on this. And a question I have for you is, so when I first was reading some of your stuff, I was shocked by the fact that and I'm not a biblical scholar at all, I never really thought about these stories as abusive in their content, which seems strange. So, but this is my question. You know, there's this famous saying that when Sojourner Truth was asked about those parts of the Bible that seemed to condone slavery, she reportedly said, "That's not in my Bible. Those things aren't in my Bible." And so I'm tempted too to think as well, and we get some of this, I think, from feminist scholarship of the Bible is, I mean, is this in your Bible or is it not? I mean, do you see this as the Word of God? And maybe that language doesn't work, but I come from a tradition where, you know, it does, right? So this is the Word of God, but there's certain things I'd like to just tear. There are many things maybe I'd like to tear out of the Bible, but some of these are, and I haven't given myself the permission to think that way. So that's my sloppy question.
No, I appreciate your question. I think that this project actually shifted my entire mindset of religion, spirituality, and God in general. I would say it is in my Bible because I think that if I put it away and like tuck it away to not be acknowledged, then I am not acknowledging where some people get their understanding of relationships. And so it is really hard for me to read, but as someone who wants to talk about religious trauma, I have to keep it in there and have it as a way where I'm like, okay, let's read it. Like let's actually dive into what you see and what you hear. And how does that work within your mind frame? So although I wish I didn't have to see it, and I wish it didn't exist, I think for it not to exist does an injustice to the people who get harm put onto them because of it.
Well, thank you. And I'm trying to watch here, folks, so I apologize if I'm out of order, but Dean Abraham and then Maggie, please.
Thank you, Professor Schlager. Sorry, I'm not on video. It's one of those days. No one should behold my face today. It's one of those days. So, Kendra, what a fantastic presentation. And this is really, it's balm for my soul today because it is, this is exactly what we hope PSR students do. Dive into the pastoral context of so many of these very complex ideas. But in listening to you responding to Professor Schlager, saying that these stories are in your Bible, then I want to probe whether violence is a necessary part of religion. So it seems to me that we can't almost have a religious understanding of anything without an accompanying violence. And then that puts us in a little bit of a bind, doesn't it? That's my question.
Thank you for that. I've never thought about that, but I do think that with that being said, that is probably why most wars are started because of religion. It'd be hard to think that it's not when most of the stories that we read are about violence and about someone getting what is owed to them or us having to find justice in that. When thinking about these stories and violence, I shifted my mindset about how I live life and not wanting to do any kind of physical harm to anyone. Not that I ever would before, but making sure that, like, if I put my hand on someone's shoulders, I'm asking them, can I touch you? When I have a conversation with someone, I ask if they're venting to me, do you want me to respond or do you just want me to listen? And so I think that because there is so much violence in these stories, that is probably why we have a lot of violence when we're thought of as like a Christian nation. And you can't get past the violence of these stories. I hope that
Maggie.
answers the question.
Hey, Kendra, thank you so much for the presentation. Couldn't resist based on the title. Kink is a formative part of the renewed spirituality I experienced in my early adulthood, and now in like formation to be in congregational ministry, and as someone who can't abandon like the role that kink played in that spiritual formation. The question is, when you teach, when you like present and offer talks from the videos you're making from this study, what advice, if any, would you give to a pastor or chaplain in attendance who is really trying to break down the pathologizing of sexuality in general that seems like that seems so hard to remove from Christian contexts? Sorry, it's not the best syntax, but.
No, that's really helpful. I think when talking to anyone who's really just like gonna have these conversations about sex in the Bible, that I tell people to be really authentic to where you came from and how you got here to it, and like to also seek out the help when you don't understand something. I think a lot of people, when it comes to like sex in the Bible, like read a story and they're like, it's fine, I understand like all the context, even if someone like asks a question. But I would say dive a little deeper, but also when you're talking to your congregation, know where they're from. Like know where they're coming from, right? Because the ways that people discuss their bodies, especially as people who are like talking to congregations, you're going to transfer some of your emotions about your body onto that, and to really dive deeper into making sure that you don't. Because the feelings that we have about our body and our sexuality are going to shine through in sermons and just conversations in general. So making sure that you talk to multiple people from multiple backgrounds, and seeing like really how they feel about when you're talking about sex to anyone. I think a lot of times when it comes to church folks, and especially people we have a hierarchy regardless if we try not to. When it's someone higher than us, we just like take it as their word. But I often want to question, like, who did you talk to before you did this sermon on sex? Did you do any kind of sex education? Did you talk to any educators? Go to Good Vibrations in San Francisco. They are a sex education store, adult store, but you can ask questions. So even seeking out those kind of resources to make sure you are giving the most accurate information when you're talking about these stories. I hope that answered your question.
William.
Hello there. I was amazed at the structure of your presentation. So concise, and just starting out with definitions and with setting your context and choosing what jewels of information to uplift. And and how you used questions to get me thinking. There was an openness to your presentation that I really appreciated. And my question is, I'm intrigued with you using a kink lens. I want to understand more about that. I can understand a lens of sexual violence around these stories. And I want to understand how your choice about the kink lens, because as a person, LGBTQI, all over the board, a sexual explorer, the thing I run up against is people pejoratizing kink. So I worry that using the lens of kink for sexual violence might provide fuel for people who want to denigrate kink. Am I making any sense? Oh, I can't hear you. I want to hear you.
Yeah.
There you go.
That makes sense. So the reason I use kink is because sex is just, typically when people think about sex, they have a very narrow way that they think about it. And kink really just includes anything that society would deem unconventional or not normal in a sex practice, right? So I used to work at Good Vibrations, and some of the thoughts, right, are like the toys that people would buy. If you're going to go outside of like one certain toy, they put it into kink. I think when talking about kink in general, I have to say I use it because I am a part of the kink community, but also I want to make it very clear to people that the taboos that are used in these videos are abusive. And so oftentimes when people think about kink, if not a part of these communities, they automatically associate it with abuse. And so that's why I tried to make it very clear that like when it comes to any kind of sexual relationship, but especially those that fall into BDSM or kink in general, are consent-based. So these break, although both are taboo, these biblical stories have the taboo, and kink is thought of as taboo. These biblical stories actually are the ones that cause abuse and harm, versus most kink relationships should not. And that communication should be the premise of those. But I think because it was talking about certain things that can happen, so someone being controlling, right? If someone's controlling your everyday, and I do use more definitions in my videos, if someone's controlling your everyday, you've consented to that if you're a part of a BDSM relationship. And these videos, the women who are told that they must go, they must be abused, they didn't consent to that. So someone's still controlling them, someone is still abusive and causing harm, but there was no communication in that. Does that help? Does that make sense a little bit more?
That is wonderful. Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Professor Jacob.
Hi, Kendra. Woohoo, you did it. So proud of your work and so happy to see how beautifully it has come through. And also just to mention that Kendra did win an award for this project because it was such a brave attempt to read these texts through the lens of kink. And so I just, I had a question, but also a curiosity. And I was like, what I was thinking was, as we read these texts and we interact with it as readers, are we fulfilling the kink inside us? Or the masochist inside us as we interact and read these texts. So just your take on that.
Yes, it's so nice to see your face. I've missed you. I definitely think that we do to some degree. I think that the stories that continue to be read over and over again, but also like the portrayals of Jesus that are seen in churches and hanging up in our homes, when they depict pain, like you're normalizing that, and we normalize that in those stories. So I think to some degree it does fulfill this like sadistic desire that we have. Although we may avoid watching the videos of Black people being killed or just harm being done in general. When you reread these stories of abuse and you actually don't think about the abuse that's happened, you are fulfilling and normalizing those desires. Especially because the same stories get heard over and over again. As someone who grew up in the Bible Belt, you would have not only hell houses, which are a whole different way of thinking about like sadism and pain, but you would always reenact Jesus's death. You would do all of these things that centered pain, and you took pride in knowing that that wouldn't happen to you. So you just kind of sat back and watched it, and as a kid, never thought of it like this. But I do think that it does fulfill some of those desires.
And can I just follow up quickly? So would the reenactment, because that's what kind of triggered this for me, when you think of the reenactment of the crucifixion narrative, would that be countered as a form of snuff film?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that even I was reading a book recently where it was centered on the women. I think it's called like the Book of Longing. It was so good, but it talked about Jesus's wife, which is also a whole different way of looking at life. But when she had to go see Jesus be crucified, reading it was so painful to me. And I realized that it's because I'm reading snuff. I'm reading a murder. And for so long, I think that we overlook that. And we are just like, it's a part of the day. It's not. You're watching someone be killed, and you're reading about that and how intense that can be to relive your like traumatic everyday experience, especially as a Black person. I think that we just like completely glaze over that sometimes.
Amanda.
My mind is blowing right back to my question. This is brilliant. The question I was going to ask was, where will we be able to access your videos? This is an absolutely incredibly rich resource, and I would love to know more about when and where we can access your research, and how can we support you in it.
You're so wonderful. Thank you for that. I just posted it on YouTube, and it's literally the Bible But Make It Kinky, the first video. I have a friend who I made them for the creative project, but they were not what I wanted them to be. So I had a friend who went to cinema school, and she helped me edit them. So I just started putting them up. I can also share my email in the chat, and I can send you my paper. My paper has a little bit more discussion around it, but I hope to continue this, although it's on my like sex talks with Kendra, because I do want to be like a therapist and like do toy reviews. I also want to continue having these conversations, more so where I read the stories that are kind of posted through the United Methodist Church as like your all the time kind of reads, you know, for holidays, and what those actually look like when you dive in a little bit deeper and think about harm.
Any other questions? Either feel free to place them in the chat or unmute yourself. Okay, I'm scanning here the room. Any questions? And then Kendra, you were going to put your email in the chat, or yeah. Oh, thank you.
Hi, this is Dexter. I just want to ask Kendra a question. First of all, I want to say your presentation blew my mind. It was very powerful, very thought-provoking, and helped me to think in ways I hadn't thought about some of these stories. So I want to thank you for that. I want to ask you a question for people who might say, well, that was during that time, that was their culture, and we're imposing our culture on their culture. How do you respond to that?
Thank you for that question. When thinking about culture, I did have to sit with that for a little bit and think about making sure that I'm not reading into these stories, things from our time. But I think when it comes to abuse, abuse is abuse. And for some of these, if we think about Sodom and Gomorrah, when the town was trying to take the angels knew that it was abusive. That's why they told them to leave the town. So I think that we can't overlook that when the angels were like, okay, they're trying to do harm to us. Yeah, he sacrificed his daughters. But they want to harm us, and this is too much. So leave and everything will be fine. So although parts of like talking about being queer and how that can be read into stories, I think even within the stories, they acknowledge that abuse is happening, right? Even with the concubine who was abused, her husband took her home and cut her up because he was harmed. He was harmed because someone wanted to assault him. He completely disregards the fact that his wife was assaulted. It was about the fact that they wanted to harm him and he knew that was wrong. So I think looking at these stories and looking at actually the men of the stories who are acknowledging abuse, but they're only acknowledging it to men and onto other men, can make us really think about how we view abuse and the abuse that continues onto women today.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Kendra. I agree with you. I mean, abuse is abuse. And as you were talking, what it made me think about is how these stories have given our society and religious people, Christian people, to abuse, to marginalize the other, women. So to me, what you talked about today was really, really powerful. And those stories have been used to hurt people today. So I think, thank you for sharing what you've shared.
Thank you. And I did just put my email in there. It doesn't have an A. My name is Kendra, but it's Kenda. And then I shared the video for the first one. So the first one is in the chat, and it's just kind of the definitions and welcome, not as in depth as I gave you today, but I will continue uploading them. And I think as I continue in this journey, if anyone ever wants to talk, you can email me and we can kind of have a discussion of different stories that we can dive into together, because I really enjoy it.
Kendra, you know, I'm mindful of what Dean Abraham was saying about aspects of our program here at PSR, and this project is just so not only mind-blowing, but helpful and useful. And I start to think, oh, churches need a resource that they can use, because in the silencing of never being, this is my limited view, never being able to talk about this in church means that the authority of these texts remain, and they become dangerous because we never talk about them. And we slide over them from David's gaze on Bathsheba to the wonderful king that David was. So not to give you more work, but it seems to me a congregational type resource would be bold and anyways, just I'm just so thrilled by this presentation. I want to be mindful of time, so we have time for one more comment or question. If there's anyone, I can't see everyone. My Zoom is getting a little strange here. If so, please unmute yourself. And
could I make a comment?
Please.
Yeah, so this is Sharon Jacob here. But I think one of my favorite parts of working with Kendra on this project was when we take out the restraints of reading the text only one way, the potential to interpret text and read it in ways that are inclusive, liberatory, or sometimes exposing of abuse or violence is, you know, the sky is the limit. So, you know, when we take out restrictions from ourselves as readers, you know, we get projects like Kendra. So that's all I want to say. Don't stop yourself from reading text and interpreting it only in one way.
Thank you, Professor Jacob. I want to take some courses from you at PSR, so that'll be in a separate email. And so thank you again, Kendra. This was really wonderful. Thank you for your time. If there are any final comments you would like to make, but I want to be respectful of your time.
Oh, I'm fine. The kids are in there. I saw that someone else had a question.
Okay, please. Professor Brody, I think.
Sure. I'm sorry we haven't met yet, but so I just wanted to throw up something, which is that I'd like to see a lot more use of New Testament texts as well. Just as a Jewish person, there's a tendency for Christians to denigrate the Old Testament, and that's highly problematic for all kinds of reasons. And so I understand, because I teach Hebrew Bible, how many of these texts exist within my corpus, and how abusive many of them are, and feel very voyeuristic reading them actually and teaching them. But I just encourage you to balance out. I'm not saying don't go there at all. I'm just saying, from a Jewish perspective, also reading kink from more New Testament texts would be a helpful balance, and especially I would say in congregational settings where they might not have the same filters that we do at PSR. So keep up the great work. I look forward to watching and hopefully using your videos. Thank you for making those available. And I'm really pleased to have had this lunch talk learning from you. So thank you.
Thank you for that. I think because I do realize that I've held you all up for so long. I appreciate that. And I do plan to do that. I think one of the next projects I wanted to take on was actually reading New Testament stories and making them queer or queering them, while also doing a kink lens, because I do think that there's a lot of work there. I think I held back a little bit because I was a little scared of how much I would find. And so I do appreciate that critique, and I will make sure that as I continue this project that I look into those stories. Yeah, if anyone ever wants to have a more like in-depth conversation or just talk about a story in general, I am always willing to set up a time where we can do that, whether it be with just one person or a group of people, because I do hope to make a resource where it's kind of just like tells my perspective and then has questions for you, to kind of open our mind and have that conversation. So thank you all for coming. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Kendra. And folks, please join us this Thursday with Carolina Ramos speaking on HIV/AIDS and Latinx communities. That's at 1 p.m. Pacific time. And then our 12th annual Georgia Harkness lecture is this Thursday evening at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time. And that is with PSR alum Bishop Megan Rohr speaking on trans theology without apology. Just be sure that you go to the CLGS website to pre-register for that Zoom webinar. So once again, Kendra, thank you. Always wonderful to have PSR alums here, especially who do such excellent work as you have done. And thank you everyone for attending, and see you soon in a Zoom room of CLGS or somewhere else. Take care, everybody.